Okay, thank you very much, Aida. Welcome everybody, and notably welcome to Ignacio and Federico for talking to us tonight. My name is Robert Bercero. I'm an assistant professor at the European Institute of the LSE, and I see probably many of you already know me, but here we go. So perhaps to quickly introduce Ignacio Garcia Bercero and Federico Steinberg, I will introduce you guys, and and then we have short interventions of you, and then we probably open up the floor to hopefully many interesting questions and comments. Ignacio, you actually have a background as a lawyer. You studied law at Complutense and also at UCL in London. And then in 1987, you joined the European Commission, already working on trade. And I believe you negotiated already in the Uruguay round, and then you increasingly became a bilateral trade negotiator. And notably, you were the lead negotiator for TTIP, which I assume many of you may have heard about, but also for the South Korea FTA and for the India FTA. So you are definitely a very experienced trade negotiator, but you also worked on UN affairs, for instance. And last year you actually were on a sabbatical to Oxford. So you try to keep involved in the academic debate as well. Federico, very nice to meet you. You're originally from Argentina, but also Spanish, as I just learned. You have a background in economics. You studied at Autónoma, but also proudly at LSE. You did the MSc in Politics of the World Economy, which I think today is the MSc in International Political Economy. And you also hold a PhD in economics from Autónoma in Madrid. And I think also a master's in international affairs from Columbia, if I'm not mistaken. You also basically then joined or worked for different international organizations, for the World Bank and also for the UN, and now you are the special advisor to High Representative Josep Borrell. And Ignacio and Federico will talk to us about EU trade policy and the challenges ahead. So thank you very much, and welcome to LSE again.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and it's really a pleasure to meet you again. I mean, the last time that we met, I think it was physical. It was at the time when I was still doing my research in Oxford, and I think we discussed the possibility of coming to talk to your students about my project, which was about WTO reform. And now it's a real pleasure to be able to discuss with you and with students in LSE the new European Union trade policy strategy. We published 2 weeks ago a document where we developed thoughts about how European trade policy should adapt to the new geopolitical and economic environment. We talk about European trade policy, which should be open, sustainable, and assertive. These are the 3 key words. And in our paper, we also present ideas about how we think one should proceed in the reform of the World Trade Organization. Now, what I would like to say in terms of my initial presentation is to highlight why we decided that it was an important moment to come out with a new strategic paper on European trade policy and what is new in terms of this trade policy strategy. Now, the first why we thought that it was necessary to present this new trade policy strategy is basically because the world has very fundamentally changed since the time when we adopted our last trade policy strategic document, Trade for All, that was about 5 years ago. It was the time before the election of President Trump in the United States. We were still very much engaged in negotiating, for instance, the TTIP agreement with the United States, and we were very active, by the way, in terms of negotiating free trade agreements with third countries, Japan, Mercosur, etc., etc. So I would say it was probably a time of a lot of optimism about the trade policy. And of course, a lot of things have changed and have happened since then. Now, we start in our trade policy strategy about talking about these mega trends, but let me highlight fundamentally 2. The first one is what we are now witnessing in terms of a major geopolitical conflict between the United States and China. Initially, this was perhaps more of an economic conflict, but now it has become a geopolitical conflict, which has, however, important economic repercussions. And that is inevitably going to impact what we and others are doing in terms of trade policy, and is having a very significant impact on the global rule-based trading system. The second factor has to do with the very fundamental economic transformations in the global economy. We have, of course, to find a way of recovering from the pandemic, but beyond the issue of economic recovery, there's also the fundamental transformation of the global economy linked to the objective of achieving the climate neutrality. This is a very fundamental goal for Europe, but not only for Europe, and also the very important changes of competitiveness which are linked to the digital transformation of our societies. So that, I think, is the fundamental new context in which European Union trade policy has to situate itself. And basically what this trade policy strategy identifies are three fundamental objectives that we would aim to pursue. The first one has to do about how trade policy can contribute not only to economic recovery, but also to the green and digital transformation of the European economy. If you look at what we say about that in the trade policy strategy, it's clear from my point of view that we are going to see in the future a much closer integration between trade policy and those domestic policies of the European Union, which are aiming towards the digital and green transformation of our economy. I think this is going to be very important in terms of how we actually develop the trade policy. It is going to be much more closely connected to a number of domestic policies. And if you want me to give an example, if you actually read in our communication, you will see that we announced 5 major legislative initiatives that would be developed in the course of this year. And of these initiatives, 3 of them have to do with sustainability issues. 4 of them are basically led by parts of the Commission other than DG Trade, but all of them have a very strong trade component attached to it. There's going to be the proposal to introduce a border carbon adjustment measure. There's going to be a proposal to introduce a new instrument to deal with the issue of imported deforestation. There's going to be a proposal on corporate due diligence to ensure that the value chain of European companies is not linked to abuses of human rights or significant problems concerning the protection of the environment. And there's also going to be 2 other initiatives, which are perhaps, if you want, more economic in nature. One having to do with how to ensure a level playing field in terms of the impact of subsidies in the European market, and the other one, what we call an anti-coercion instrument, to be sure that the European Union has the tools to react when it is actually seeing its own policy space being threatened by action by others. So all of this shows that there's going to be much closer integration between European Union trade policy and a number of domestic policies. The second fundamental change is that what we are witnessing now is the most fundamental crisis of the rule-based trading system since the WTO was created. The crisis of the WTO has become existential, and we feel that it's extremely important to concentrate as the first priority for European Union trade policy into developing an alliance of countries that want to see the WTO being significantly reformed. This, of course, is going to be a very important effort of multilateral diplomacy. It's not something that the European Union can do on its own, but we certainly would want to work with like-minded countries and particularly with the United States to try to find a way forward to modernize the WTO as an institution, to restore a functioning dispute settlement system, to ensure that the rules of the game are updated and take into account the fundamental economic challenges of the 21st century, issues like digital trade, but also how to ensure that there's no distortions of competition due to the role of the state in the economy, which is at the heart of the conflicts that related to the role of China in the global trading system. On all of those issues, I think you are going to see a much stronger priority of European Union trade policy in working with other countries in Geneva to see how we can move forward this agenda. And we think the fact that we have now a new director general in the WTO who is strongly committed to WTO reform is an important element. And we very much hope that we will be able to work constructively with the new US administration as soon as the new USTR, Catherine Tai, has been confirmed. Now, this is not going to, however, to be simple. I mean, it is never, multilateral diplomacy by definition is never simple. It's going to be a complicated process. It would take some time, but I think you will see that this is going to become very central in terms of how Europe wants to develop its trade policy in this new phase. Finally, I think the third fundamental objective that we mentioned has to do with ensure that we can properly enforce our rights. As I have said before, over the last 15 years, the European Union has been very active in terms of negotiating trade agreements. We have a very developed network of free trade agreements in all continents of the world. We still have, of course, some important negotiations ongoing, and we still have some challenges in terms of getting some agreements ratified. And of course, it cannot be excluded that there could be some new trade negotiations. But a much greater focus is going to be how we can effectively use the network of trade agreements that we have to ensure that they are properly implemented, that they are also properly enforced. So implementation and enforcement is going to become a much central element in terms of European Union trade policy. So if you want me to summarize what is new, a very strong focus on integration between trade policy and other European Union policies, particularly with a very strong focus on sustainability. Secondly, a strong focus about working with others to ensure that the WTO can be effectively reformed. And thirdly, without excluding the new free trade negotiations, a much greater focus on the implementation and enforcement of those agreements that we actually already have. So I think I would leave it there, and happy, of course, to participate in the debate.
Okay, thank you very much, Ignacio, for the interesting overview of the new trade strategy. Federico, may I ask you to
Sure.
Share your thoughts? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to see the Spanish and the European society so active at LSC. Actually, I think Ignacio made a fantastic overview of the strategy. So I wanted to concentrate on some related topics, which reinforce a little bit what he was saying on this key idea that the EU has to find a new role in this international landscape, which is characterized much more by great power rivalry and competition between the US and China. And for that, trade policy is one of the most clear available instruments. First, because the EU, as you well know, speaks with one voice in trade and not in many other aspects. But more importantly, because in trade, we have the opportunity of linking different policies. Ignacio mentioned climate, but also foreign policy more broadly, even industrial policy, and also, projecting not only our values as a normative power, which is what we know we're good at, soft power basically, but also trying to learn to be, use the language of power, as the High Representative normally puts it. But more specifically, this means not being so nice to everybody all the time. We have to learn that sometimes we're going to be needing to do things that are not so nice, not so appropriate, and we have to actually be able to balance when this is necessary, something that probably the EU is not so good at doing, and also because it depends on a number of member states that share different views, right? So to organize my ideas, I think that I'm going to talk first about the external challenges and how the EU develops on that, and also an internal challenge, which I think is not negligible, which is that we have a crisis of legitimacy of free trade and an increase in anti-globalization movement in many member states that also translates sometimes into an anti-European sentiment and is reflected in the electoral growth of some of the Eurocritic or anti-globalization parties. And despite the fact that in opinion polls, in Eurobarometers, you observe overall quite a lot of support for free trade, and trade is in the DNA of the union, I think we also need to address the legitimacy of the issue and go back maybe to some of the issues that arose during the negotiations of TTIP, for example, in which you had some discontent in the public opinion, which has more to do about perceptions than reality many times, as Ignacio well knows. But that is something we have to take into account and has to do with winners and losers from trade agreements, right? But to start with the international part and the external challenge, I think, you're all very well aware that there's been a change in the structure of the international system and in the balance of power, and this comfortable world in which the EU felt very, very conveniently positioned, because we had the security umbrella of the US, and we also had global companies, and we were able to operate under a rules-based system in which we had a lot of influence, and we were very, conveniently placed there to basically use an economic, a liberal view of international trade, in which this is a win-win situation, and trade is not a tool of foreign policy explicitly, but it has more to do with what we study in economics as additional gains from trade. This world is being rapidly eroded. And we see that the two big powers, so China on the one hand and the US on the other, are increasingly challenging the system. I think that with the Biden administration, this might look a bit different, of course. Firstly, because Trump perceived the union as an economic rival and not as a geopolitical ally. And Biden seems to be willing to go back to the idea of a transatlantic relation that is more solid. But still, I think we can expect the US to continue its introspection and to be more isolationist. And the Chinese strategy of the dual circulation also, points to the fact that maybe the Chinese, want to develop their internal market, increase domestic demand, be less reliant on exports, and therefore be more inward-looking. So I think that we can anticipate that the world is going to be, less globalized. I'm not predicting at all, and we don't know, a reversal of globalization, and probably globalization could also increase in the services, digital-related trade. But overall, I think we can expect, a little bit of a backlash against globalization, more protectionist pressures, and also something that might be, inevitable, which is an increased decoupling between the American and the Chinese economies, right? And the goal of the European Union is actually not to decouple from anybody and rewrite the rules of the game, or lead the rewriting of the rules of the game, as Ignacio was saying, leading coalition of like-minded countries. And we can think about Japan and Canada and South Korea and some Latin Americans, the UK, and of course the US. To actually having the goal of having a system or new rules that make the Chinese economic model compatible to the Western economic models, to avoid this decoupling, to avoid this worst case scenario of some people call it neo-imperialism, or new areas of influence around China, around the US, in which Europe is going to feel divided and neglected, right? Ideally, as some German diplomat put it to me recently, we would love to keep being protected by the US and exporting as much as possible to China, but this seems to be more difficult than in the past, right? So as Ignacio was saying, the trade policy strategy tries to promote this idea, but also to prepare for this worst case scenario, in which, you know, we have more decoupling, we have a little bit of disintegration in the global economy, we have more protectionism, and for that it becomes essential to have, you know, a safety net of preferential trade agreements. And what's interesting, and at least I was surprised when I read the strategy, the EU seems to be, you know, okay with the agreements that are on the table. Let's just push for ratification of them and not go beyond, right? This is understandable because there was an acceleration of agreements in the last years. That's something also that was very welcome. I was, you know, positively surprised of the speed at which the EU closed an agreement with Japan, you know, actually leaving the investment issues that were more controversial on the side. Maybe, Robert, you have something to say about investment later. And also, you know, with the upgrading of the agreement with Mexico and the issue with Chile and Mercosur, etc. So, you know, we have that. And also we have, the EU has just finalized the comprehensive agreement on investment with China, which I think shows the way of what the EU wants to do, which is continue the engagement, avoid decoupling, but also, you know, being a little bit tougher and setting the red lines more clearly, because European citizens have repeatedly said that values matter, that we want to promote the green and human rights and all these elements that, by the way, they were there in the trade policy strategy of 2015, but now they are reinforced much more, right? So to summarize this, basically is, you know, promote the rewriting of the multilateral system, and if it's not possible, at least have a safety net of preferential agreements that allows us to continue trading, and also making it possible to continue the engagement with China as much as possible, because you know, the view that the Trump strategy is not something that we share, right? Now, besides that, I think it's quite important that we understand that, you know, inside the Union, there's a growing concern with trade, right? This is not unique of the EU. It's also happening in the US and in other countries. Trade is probably not to blame so much than technology. We have read all the sorts of papers that say that technology has displaced more workers and has eroded the good manufacturing jobs much more than trade. But on the other hand, we have some evidence, you know, this work by authors and co-authors that say that, you know, the concentration of losses in industrial areas have generated a lot of frustration, right? But we have to understand that in the case of the European Union trade policy, we have a problem, which is that the Commission negotiates the agreements for the whole of the EU, for the 27, for the 450 plus million consumers. But then, you know, the gains from trade are not very well distributed sometimes between different countries. And since we don't have a fiscal union in the EU, and this is a matter for discussion for another day, right? The completion of EMU and the fiscal union, then we don't have a mechanism for transferring. Maybe for specific trade agreements, you have a lot of gains in Finland and no gains in Portugal. And this creates a lot of frustration, right? So if we're really serious about recuperating the legitimacy of trade agreements in a context in which probably, you know, the West is going to be in decline vis-a-vis Asia, and more importantly, and we've seen this in some of these recent days, you know, the recovery in Europe from the pandemic is slower than in the US, so the decline of Europe might be, you know, more abrupt than the decline of the US, then we might see more and more frustration, right? And let's remember that if we keep on having, you know, anti-European governments in the council sitting, like the ones we have in Hungary or in Poland, you know, ratification of free trade agreements is going to be very difficult, but also proceeding with European integration even more, right? So in a way, we have to find content for this idea of the Europe that protects, that Macron talks about all the time. And, you know, the strategy tries to do that with this concept of, you know, open strategic autonomy, which is the big, you know, buzzword that we're going to be listening a lot about, and that I'm also working to try to generate some narrative around it, which I think is a very good idea, because we need, you know, to show to our citizens that we're thinking about it, and this is something which is actually relevant, which is that we want to be open and transparent and autonomous, but at the same time, we need to start protecting a bit more the losers from globalization or from the big trends, right? And if we don't take that into account, I think the legitimacy issue is going to become more complicated, and then it won't matter how capable we are in the foreign side we're going to be losing support from inside, and that's going to be problematic. So big challenges ahead, but I think we are on the right track. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Federico, for your interesting thoughts. Definitely a very ambitious trade agenda, dealing with many different aspects and domestic and international challenges. Perhaps I immediately open the floor because I don't think we have that much time, and I'm sure there are some questions. Otherwise, I can ask questions. But if you have questions, please raise your hand so that I can see. Yeah. Shall we perhaps collect? Or we can already start with Jonathan, and then we can perhaps see who else has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Garcia. The question is for you. You mentioned this issue of a carbon border adjustment mechanism, and I know that there is not a proposal yet from the European Commission how this will look like, but maybe you can tell us already what you are preferring. Which option do you want to implement it into the existing carbon trading scheme, or will it be a border tax, or how will it look like? And also, who is working on it, and how does the collaboration between DG Trade and the other Director Generals work?
Thank you very much. Perhaps I think that's a quite big question. So perhaps I allow Federico and Ignacio to respond directly, and then we can take Kaspar's question.
Well, thank you very much. As indeed a very topical question, because we are now getting to the crunch of the moment when we would need to finalize a proposal that will most likely be presented in the month of June. And as you know, before there's a proposal for legislation in the European Union, we have to go through a process of impact assessment. So we are precisely at the stage where we are finalizing the presentation of options for discussion with the impact assessment board. I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to tell you what is the option that will be chosen eventually by the Commission, but you seem to be quite well informed in the sense that there are fundamentally two possible options. One option would be to work on the basis of what we actually have domestically in the European Union, which is the emission trading scheme, and to devise a measure at the border which is as close as possible to the emission trading scheme that we apply domestically. And that, of course, because of the need to ensure that whatever it is that we do is WTO compatible. I mean, from the very beginning, when President von der Leyen announced this initiative, she was very clear in saying that we would introduce a border carbon adjustment measure in order to tackle the problem of carbon leakage, which is an environmental challenge. Unless, of course, there was going to be a situation in which the ambition of others matches that of the European Union, but that we would do it in a manner which is fully compatible with our WTO obligations. So one of the possible options would be to look into what we are actually doing domestically, the emission trading scheme, and to apply a measure at the border for imported products, which is as close as possible, as close as administratively possible to what we actually apply domestically. And of course, we would need to decide to which particular sectors it would apply, because it would not necessarily apply to all the sectors which are exposed to carbon leakage in the first instance. It would probably be introduced gradually. So that is one option. The other option is to leave to one side what we are actually doing domestically now and introduce something like a tax, which of course then it will have to be a tax which applies equally to domestic products and to imported products, and which will be complementary to the emission trading scheme. Basically speaking, these are the two big options which are being discussed. Both of them can be designed in a manner which is WTO compatible. So we are currently looking into the pros and cons of the two options, and there will be a proposal that will be tabled by the Commission, most likely in the month of June, and then it would start the whole legislative process that, as you know, in the European Union is something which takes time. So I think there will be plenty of time to discuss this issue with our trading partners, because it's not going to be like the Commission presents the proposal in June and Council and Parliament agree on this proposal in September. It's going to take a little bit longer a little bit longer than that. There will be plenty of opportunities to discuss exactly how this measure is going to be implemented, what is going to be the impact on our trading partners, what is the scope for cooperating with others, because of course the issue of carbon leakage is something that is not exclusively a concern of the European Union. As more countries game up their climate ambition and introduce domestically measures to achieve the goal of climate neutrality, the greater that there's going to be the concern that these efforts could be nullified if imported products could just basically nullify the efforts that you are doing domestically. So the issue of carbon leakage is going to be a concern not only of the European Union. We know that other countries like Canada, like the United States, are also reflecting about what to do on that. So it's going to be something that would be very important with a lot of trade implications, and where certainly we would expect that we would need to engage very actively with our trading partners to explain what we are doing and how this is linked to the efforts that we are working to achieve an ambitious outcome in COP26, which is of course when we expect that all the large emitters would be committed towards the goal of climate neutrality.
Just a quick comment on that, Robert, if I may, before Casper, I think, has the floor. I think it's very important, this last thing you said, Ignacio, because we're getting mixed signals from the US, right? On the one hand, we've heard that they also are interested and think that this should be part of the new rules of the game in trade. However, John Kerry came out last week, I think, saying that the EU should not move alone and first. And this is precisely the kind of example I was referring to before, right? So, traditionally we would, wait and consult the US before and not be so sure if we want to do it or not. I think the EU is committed to this, is convinced. And the goal would be to make it, and ideally, I would say, would be to present a proposal that, as many trading partners agree with, mainly in the West, and that, would probably force China in a way to accept to a certain degree this. Otherwise, it's going to be more difficult than people might interpret it, or countries, as a protectionist measure, which is not what we are aiming at, right? For the first time, I think we got the economics and the justification for the adjustment, for environmental tariffs, right? Because historically, whenever the EU was talking about this in the 1990s with the Singapore issues, etc., it appeared much more like a protectionist excuse for French farmers. Let's put it this way, given that I can talk more freely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Casper, you want to ask your question?
Yes. First of all, I would like to thank the speakers to be with us here tonight and share their expertise on EU trade policies. I'm sure that a lot of students appreciate you making time to speak to us. So I have two separate questions. My first question is, what are the prospects for concluding TTIP during the Biden administration? And what are the most important obstacles to the conclusion of TTIP? And my second question relates to rare earths minerals. So one of the main objectives of the EU trade strategy is a green recovery. And a lot of green technologies rely on rare earth minerals. And these rare earth minerals, so China controls 80% of the refinement of these rare earth minerals. So it has a monopolistic position when it comes to refining these resources that the EU would hypothetically need for its green recovery. An example is lithium-ion batteries for electric cars. So how or which strategies does the EU have for ensuring the supply of rare earth minerals on which our green recovery depends?
Okay, thank you very much. Is there already a taker here, Ignacio or Federico?
Well, I'm happy to give it a go, particularly on the first one, or I would also say a few words on the second one. Now, what are the prospects of concluding TTIP with the Biden administration? I mean, I have a short answer, which is none, I would do a little bit of a longer answer. Now, I think that at this point in time, it seems to be very clear to us that it is not the intention of the Biden administration to go back to the TTIP negotiations. Nor is it something, by the way, that the European Union at this point in time it is envisaging. We think that the political context that we have today is a very different one to the one that took place when the TTIP negotiations were in place. The priority in terms of how we would want to engage with the United States is how we can work together towards restoring the rule-based trading system, modernizing the WTO as an institution, using the WTO as a forum to develop rules to deal with the challenges of competition with state-based economies like China, the challenge of digital trade, restoring a functioning dispute settlement system. All of those are issues which are only going to happen if the United States and the European Union cooperate strategically, and that's very much why we will see politically as being the top priority in terms of transatlantic trade relations. Negotiating a bilateral free trade agreement is not, quite frankly, at this point in time, a priority. And to be very, very frank, some of the reasons that make it very difficult to conclude a trade negotiation with the Obama administration are going to be very, very much still there with the Biden administration. I mean, if you look, for instance, into the policies of the new administration on government procurement, I don't think that we are going to see any opening of the trade policy in that connection. So at this point in time, I would say the priority for us in terms of the transatlantic relations is A, to cooperate in terms of the WTO reform agenda, to cooperate also when it comes to new technologies. That's why one of the ideas that we have actually discussed already with the Trump administration and that we are now discussing with the Biden administration is the establishment of what we call a Trade and Technology Council, which is basically cooperating with the United States when it comes to issues like technologies in the digital sphere, when it comes to issues like investment screening. So all of those issues are issues on which we think that there's a scope for closer transatlantic cooperation. But things like negotiating about tariffs, quite frankly, we don't really see it as being a priority in terms of our engagement with the United States at this point in time. Now, what you have mentioned of rare earths is one of the very, very good examples of the areas where we are concerned about the risk of being vulnerable because of excessive dependency on of limited sources of supply. Now, one of the issues that the European Union is going to be looking at is precisely how to reduce vulnerabilities which are linked to strategic dependencies. This is an issue which is going to be developed in the new industrial policy strategy that would be actually presented, I believe, later in the month of April. And of course, we are very much discussing with our colleagues in the Commission what would be the priority areas where we need to find ways of diversify our sources of supply so as not to be excessively dependent on one particular source of supply. By the way, it is also an interesting area in terms of potential cooperation with the United States, because you will be aware that very recently the Biden administration also announced that it was going to undertake a review of supply chain dependencies. That's an exercise which has just been launched by the new US administration. And indeed, I think that rare earths was one of the sectors where the US indicated that they were also concerned if there was excessive dependency about one source of supply. So I cannot really prejudge what the solution would be, but certainly it's one of the areas where I think we will be looking very much in the need to ensure that we have enough strategic autonomy, that we are not excessively dependent on one supplier who could potentially be tempted to weaponize his trade against the interests of the European Union. So that's certainly going to be one of the issues that we will be looking into, in particular in the context of the new industrial policy strategy.
Just a quick comment, maybe to complement what Ignacio said. I think the main goal of the transatlantic relation at this point, besides WTO reform, is to get rid of the tariffs we have in place. There's been some, some good news on the Airbus Boeing reciprocal tariffs, but we also have the steel and aluminum, and also to recuperate or at least de-escalate those tariffs before we can get into new dialogue. So I would say if the EU and the US get that, that would be more than enough, at least in these first 2 or 3 years, and then WTO collaboration, because as Ignacio was saying, we have to understand that the US already passed the new Buy American provision, and the approach that the Democratic Party is going to take to trade is not particularly super pro-free trade. I mean, I think there's more rhetoric on the support of multilateralism than real support of new trade agreements that I don't see forthcoming because of the public opinion situation in the US. And on rare earths, I completely agree as well. The only additional point would be that the EU, what it has shown is that its approach to some of the activities that China does in terms of subsidies or intellectual property, in which many businesses would agree with the approach that the Trump administration had, but the European Union and the Commission have decisively taken a different approach, which is engagement, right? Because there's dependency, but there's also interdependency. I mean, the Chinese are interested on exporting these products, so therefore this at least should be some safety element for at least maintaining good relationship and avoiding disruptions. But of course, this is a crucial element which has to do with how vulnerable we are and how we need to be more autonomous.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Perhaps if there are other questions, otherwise I actually have 2 questions, if I may abuse my position here as chair. Federico, thank you very much. You were talking a lot about the new or the very normative angle of EU trade policy, and at the same time we've been discussing quite a bit the comprehensive agreement on investment with China. And I guess some critics, notably in the European Parliament, may actually say that this particular agreement actually seems to go very much against the normative agenda of the European Union, taking into consideration situation with the Uyghur minorities and the backlash against democracy in Hong Kong. So my question would be a little bit, how do you square this? And also, what do you think are actually the chances of this agreement getting through the European Parliament, because it will have to get ratified by the European Parliament, right? And then the second question, I guess, is very big, and we could probably spend many hours discussing that. How does the European Union actually envision the WTO to look like in a few years, when hopefully this crisis of the dispute settlement body, but also actually the negotiating crisis, right, that the Doha development round collapse, what will be the role and the shape of the WTO in, say, 10 years? Yeah, so, sorry, very big questions, but perhaps some ideas you could share with us. Thank you.
Ignacio, you want to go first as well?
Okay, Federico. I thought that you okay. No, I
can start with Kai if you want. Whatever.
Yeah. Why don't you start with Kai, and then I will go to WTO and comment on what you say on Kai.
Okay. Well, Kai, I think it's. I mean, you're right, Robert. In a way, you can make this criticism. On the other hand, I think that the EU actually, and the same happens with Mercosur, for those people that say, you should not talk to Bolsonaro because he's destroying the Amazon. And the answer tends to be, we need to talk to Bolsonaro and use trade policy to at least avoid that he destroys parts of the Amazon, right? So in a way, my impression is that the explanation, but maybe it's not enough for some very idealistic European citizens, but the reality is what it is, and it's a little bit far away from our desires sometimes. And for example, if with Kai, we can be able to make sure that the Chinese authorities ratify some of the elements of the International Labour Organization treaties that they have not, this would be a big gain. If we can make sure that they are a bit more transparent, this would be a big gain. And and also other elements that are on the table. And if we don't engage, probably we are not going to get much on Hong Kong on minorities, right? So the approach is a little bit like that. It's a bit more pragmatic in a way, but with the objective of making gradual improvements in our goals that are very idealistic sometimes, right? So this, I guess, this would be a reasonable answer, just like we keep on talking to Saudi Arabia because we are importing some oil, right? This is similar element, right? On WTO, sorry, and on the parliament, I think, you know, China is a big issue, and if this is well explained, my impression is that the agreement could be ratified, right? But for that, you need to go back to the legitimacy issue that I mentioned before, I think, to some extent, right? And on WTO reform, of course, Ignacio knows much more, but the wish list of the EU was quite clear, right? We wanted to you know, have rules on subsidies. Well, of course, resolve the problem of the appellate body of the settlement mechanism, redefine what is when it's justified or not to use national security arguments for tariffs, redefine the concept of developing country, you know, have new regulations for the new economy, digital, e-commerce, etc. Clarify the issue of intellectual property and intellectual property theft, if you want to call it like that. Ideally, maybe change unanimity for qualified majority voting, but you know, we need to do this at home before with foreign policy and taxation, so it's a big difficulty. Maybe something on global taxation of big tech, but I know this is not really inside the WTO, it's more OECD. So you know, so the wish list is kind of big, and the ultimate goal is to return to a rules-based system which is perceived as legitimate for everybody, so nobody uses the language of power, and we are not in the law of the jungle. We are in the rules-based system.
Yeah, no, I will be happy to also try to answer your questions. Now, first on the KAI, I very much agree with what Federico has said, but let me try to add one thought. I mean, the fundamental question is, what is your objective vis-a-vis China? Of course, if your objective is to have a total decoupling between your economy and the Chinese economy, then yes, probably you don't want to think about doing something like the KAI. But quite frankly, I don't really know which is the country in the world which at this point in time is seeking to have a global decoupling with the Chinese economy. Now, maybe it is in some sectors which are linked to certain technologies, there is going to be decoupling, that's going to be unavoidable, but all of us are still going to want to have a reasonable economic engagement with China. Now, it is simple to criticize the European Union for having concluded the KAI. I mean, I don't hear a lot of people criticizing Australia or Japan for having concluded a free trade agreement with China, which is something which no one is thinking about doing in the European Union. And the United States, unless they have decided to change totally their policy, they also concluded a phase one agreement, which includes a number of elements to have economic engagement with China. What is very important is to actually put the KAI in perspective. The KAI is just one of the instruments that we actually have in terms of our relationship with China. It is, by the way, the only country with which China has agreed on legally binding commitments on both protection of the environment and protection of labor rights. That's something they have not included in any of their other agreements with other countries. And of course, we think this is very important, but we are not being naive in pretending that the KAI by itself is going to solve all the problems relating to Chinese policy. That's why you need to see this also together with a number of autonomous actions that the European Union is going to develop. The European Union is going to develop an instrument to tackle the issue of forced labor. At this point in time, we don't have it in the books, but that's something that we are currently working on an impact assessment, and we will come with a proposal about an instrument to tackle the issue of forced labor. We are also working on an instrument to strengthen our defenses vis-a-vis subsidies, which have a distortive impact on the single market. So I think you need to see KAI as part of a broader set of policies. that aim to ensure that there is fair competition with China, because our fundamental concern is how to ensure fairness, how to ensure a level playing field when it comes to competition with China. And a lot of what we also want to do in the WTO is precisely to modernize the rules of the WTO so they are better equipped to ensure that there is fair competition in those cases in which the state plays a very important role in the economy. Now, how is the WTO going to look like in 10 years? I don't know, because I think that, in my view, we really have 4 to 5 years to get the WTO in the right place. If we failed in the next 4 or 5 years to reform the WTO, I really would be very, very worried about our capacity to maintain a workable, rule-based trading system, which is global in nature. You may then go to a total fragmentation of the trading system. So what I would think we should really be focusing is what are those changes which are possible if we actually ensure that like-minded countries cooperate closely in the next 4 to 5 years. And that would imply that we would certainly need to find a way of restoring a binding dispute settlement system with an independent appellate body. But it's going to probably be very different to the dispute settlement system that we had before. It's going to be probably more restrained in terms of the adjudicating function, but it will still need to be binding and still will need to keep an independent appellate body. We need to find a way of modernizing the rule book of the WTO, particularly when it comes to the issues of digital trade and when it comes to the issues relating to the interface between different economic systems, the role of the state, industrial subsidies, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer. Now, we are not going to do this with a single undertaking. We are not going to do this with a big negotiating round. You could only succeed if you introduce, if you make WTO members accept that the only way to progress on the rule front is going to integrate into the WTO system open plurilateral agreements. And exactly how to do this integration of open plurilateral agreements is going to be one of the big challenges in terms of WTO reform. And finally, we would need to have a WTO where it is perfectly natural to go to a meeting in Geneva and discuss climate change and discuss protection of workers' rights. Now, we are not saying necessarily you wanted to fundamentally modify the rules of the WTO in those areas, but it has to be fully acceptable by countries in the WTO that the debate about the interaction between trade and climate policies and interaction between trade and policies relating to the protection of workers' rights is a perfectly legitimate issue for discussion and deliberation within a trade context. So those, I would say, are the big things that we need to be able to achieve. Cooperating closely with the United States will be very important, but it would certainly not be sufficient. We would need to see how to engage, by the way, not only with China, also with some other major economies like India, South Africa, who for a number of reasons have a very different perspective about what they want to get from the WTO. And finding a dialogue with all these countries is going to be the critical challenge for multilateral diplomacy over the next few years. Now, we hope that the United States is going to be engaged in that direction, because in the absence of US engagement, quite frankly, it's going to be very, very difficult to get things moving. I don't say that US engagement is enough, but it's certainly in the absence of US engagement, it will be very difficult to get things moving. And if there's no change in the next 4 or 5 years, I think inevitably we are going to go through a fragmentation of the rules-based trading system, which would be, I think, quite damaging in terms of our economic and political interests.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. Very interesting. And we are actually also exactly on time, which is great. So thank you really for all your input, Ignacio and Federico. I definitely have a lot of food for thought now. And also let me thank Aida Silvera Rocaber and Caroline Mashka and Jose Luis Ortega from the Spanish Society and European Societies for organizing this event. It's great. And yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure.
Thanks, we are pleasure. See you soon. Bye.
Bye.
Very much.